Today, we're going to go over something very fundamental to Runeterra and digital card games in general, which is keeping an eye on your opponent's mana and working out which cards they could have and trying to play around them. Hi there, I'm Telebait, and I've reached Master every single season in Runeterra, and I release weekly guides just like this one to help you improve at Runeterra. So subscribe if you want to see more guides just like this. When it comes to playing around cards in Runeterra, you probably don't know the cards as well as I do. I've put tons and tons of hours in this game. I know every card. I can just see the picture of the card and I have it in my head just like that. But for newer players especially, this is not easy. You don't know what any of the cards do. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to take you through what I think the key cards are for each region that you need to play around. So when you go against a deck online, you know exactly what cards you should be playing around. I will say I haven't covered every single card in this list. And that's just because I didn't want to overwhelm you with a ridiculous number of cards. I just wanted to focus on cards which are seeing a lot of play higher up the ladder. So if you follow me on Twitter or you've been browsing Reddit recently, I've posted my sort of cheat sheet where it has all these cards in a nice image. And I've tried to generate it in a format which is somewhat mobile friendly. I'll put a link to my Twitter below and you can take the cheat sheet straight from there. So in your future games, if you're trying to remember what cards I was talking about, this cheat sheet should help you out a ton. Because in the cheat sheet, to keep it small, I've covered up a lot of the cards, and all you can see really is the image. I'm going to go through it quickly and explain what each card is and how I would play around it. So hopefully at the time, the cheat sheet can just work as a prompt to jog your memory. You can try and remember what I said and play around it. So for the cheat sheet, I've split it up into burst spells, fast spells, slow spells, and units, and then into each region. We're going to start off with Demacia here. First up, we have Ranger's Resolve. And this is 1 mana, give all your units tough for this round. And the main way this punishes you is if you pick a lot of trades and you only just do enough damage to kill multiple units, they can play Ranger's Resolve and save 2 or 3 units with this one spell. It's just something to keep in mind when you're setting blocks up against aggressive Demacia decks. It's not usually seen in slower Demacia decks. It's more of Scouts, which is the Demacia Bilgewater combo. You'll see this card. Sharp Sight is a 2 mana, give a unit +2/+2 and block elusives this round. So this is a card seen in pretty much every version of Demacia. It's really, really strong. If you're against Demacia, they probably run Sharp Sight. So this is just a combat trick you've got to be aware of. Sometimes it's good to force out spells, but don't block or attack with a valuable champion if they could potentially play Sharp Sight to allow them to kill the champion quite easily. And Riposte is another spell quite commonly seen in Demacia. It's mostly seen in Fiora decks. It's a 4 mana, give an ally +3 and barrier. It's usually the barrier you've got to be careful about, because usually they're playing this on Fiora and they're trying to use Fiora as their win condition. So you just need to make sure if your opponent has 4 mana banked, they could pull this out, and you want to save something to possibly pop the barrier. So if you're playing something like P&Z, you can use Mystic Shot to break the barrier. That's just an example. Each region will have a different way they could potentially deal with the barrier. So for fast spells, this is where we're really looking at the removal spells in Demacia. And one thing you'll notice about all the removal spells in Demacia is that they are reliant on having a unit on the board. So this is Demacia's big weakness. If they don't have units on the board, they don't have access to their removal spells. And this is how you really want to try and punish them. Keep their units off the board. So single combat basically means 2 units strike each other. This is very common in Demacia decks, and it's just a card you need to be aware of, especially if you're planning to play down a valuable unit. And if they could potentially get a good trade on your unit using single combat, you need to think very carefully about playing that unit and make sure you have some sort of combat trick up or a way to protect that unit from single combat. Concerted Strike is very similar. It's a very, very powerful spell. I actually think this spell is borderline OP and just going under everyone's radar. It's 2 units strike another unit, and because it's 5 mana, you don't see it until later on in the game. But if you're dropping a big, powerful unit later on, you need to be aware of Concerted Strike and just make sure that your unit's health has more health than 2 of your opponent's units' attacks combined. And one thing I'll mention with a lot of these spells as well is if they're committing 5 mana on Concerted Strike to kill a 4 mana unit, you're completely happy. 5 mana is completely fine, but if you're playing a 6 mana unit and they kill it in Concerted Strike, that's when they get advantage. So that's when you should be really playing around these. Like if you're playing a 2 mana unit and it gets killed by single combat, then you're kind of okay with it. You traded 2 mana for 2 mana and a card for a card. That's fine. But if you're playing more than that, that's when you start going at a disadvantage. And in Runeterra, it's when all these disadvantages build up. That's how you end up losing a game. Finally, you get Judgment. And this really isn't seen at higher ranks, but I know it's definitely very common at lower ranks, and it's a good way to cheese wins with Fiora. And it's just a battling ally strikes all battling enemies. So if your opponent's banking 8 mana with Demacia, you should probably expect them to have Judgment, and you just need to make sure when you attack in, you don't attack in with all your units. You keep some back, so that way if they Judgment, they only kill half your board rather than your whole board. For slow spells and Demacia, we're looking at Relentless Pursuit here, and this is quite common in a variety of Demacia decks, and it's just something you need to be careful of. I've definitely lost a few times because I didn't respect my opponent's ability to rally. And finally, we have Radiant Guardian. Radiant Guardian isn't really seen that much in the meta at the moment, but if you're playing an aggressive deck, Radiant Guardian can really mess you up. Radiant Guardian has Lifesteal and Tough, which is a really strong combination, and basically will allow your opponent to regenerate a lot of health. It counters a lot of aggressive strategy. So if your opponent has 5 mana up, you need to be very careful about killing one of their units because it could proc Radiant Guardian. And it's only for aggressive decks, but it's something you should definitely keep in mind if you're playing an aggressive deck. Okay, next up we have the Frejlord. And one thing you'll notice about Frejlord is they only have burst and slow speed spells. It's kind of like a feature of the region that they don't have fast speed spells. And in general, a lot of their combat tricks are revolving around reducing your attack. The key spells I play around is Troll Chant, and this is just something when you're attacking in you need to be aware of. It's usually not a big issue for you unless you're attacking in with a unit with quick attack and they need to use the quick attack to survive. Because Frejlord don't have a lot of combat tricks which increase their attack, you just need to be aware of those situations where you attack in, you expect to trade one unit for another, and then he uses something like Troll Chant, so you lose your unit and he keeps his unit. And that's kind of applies with all the Frostbite spells as well. Brittle Steel, Flash Freeze, Harsh Winds. And generally the decks you see these in, the Troll Chants are in most Frejlord decks now. The Freezes are seen in a variety of decks as well. Anivia, Ash, and there's even a Teemo Ezreal deck going around now. So in most Frejlord decks you probably see some of these. For their removal, Frejlord always has slow speed removals. And slow speed is something you can play around because it can't be used in combat, and that's really, really key. Let's say my opponent has 4 mana banked, and I have 2 units on the board, both with 2 health, and I'm against Avalanche. It's my attacking turn. I could develop another unit, and then my opponent uses Avalanche. I could kill all 3 units. Or I could open attack in, get the damage into his Nexus, and then he can Avalanche afterwards, but at that point, I've already got damage in on his Nexus, and my units have got some value. So that's the main counter to slow spells, is that you always look to open attack. Typically, your opponent will try and punish your development. So even if you're not on the attacking turn, they might pass, expect you to play something, and then after you play something, use Avalanche. If your opponent passes and has 4 mana banked up, and you can only play units with 2 health, you need to really consider just passing, ending that round, getting onto your attack, attacking in, and then your opponent will use Avalanche to kill your units already on the board, and then you can redevelop. Nice Quake's the same thing, does 3 damage to everything. You play around these in a very similar way. Finally, you have Feel the Rush, and this is a card you just need to be aware of when your opponent has 9 mana and 3 spell mana banked, that they could drop this as a big sort of bomb to kill you, and you see it in mostly Trundle Tryndamere decks is where you usually see this, and people use it as a sort of finisher, and just make sure you have enough blockers to keep you alive if your opponent drops this, if you don't have a way to directly counter it. Okay, on to Ionia. Basically, Ionia is quite a small list. There's not really that many combat tricks to see a lot of in Ionia. The only one I really see is Spirit's Refuge, which is Barrier and Lifesteal, and this is typically seen in Fiora Shen. I don't really see it in decks outside of that. And much like Riposte, Spirit's Refuge, you just need to make sure you have a way to break the barrier. If you're playing an aggressive deck, you just need to be aware of the potential for your opponent to grant Lifesteal. And Lifesteal in itself is a keyword you need to be playing around all the time through the way you attack. So let's say I had a board with a bunch of different units with different attacks, and my opponent was very low on health, and he was playing Ionia. Let's say he had 1 unit with a lot of attack, let's say 6 or 7 attack, who knows, and he has 4 mana bank. So he could use Spirit's Refuge, block, and use the Lifesteal to keep himself alive. But if I attack in the right order, it makes that very, very difficult to do. So generally, if you're going for the kill on your opponent, and they have a risk of playing a spell which can grant Lifesteal, you need to attack so that your weakest units attack first. And this way, if he wants to get the Lifesteal in early, he has to block one of your weaker units, and therefore your stronger units will be able to attack directly into the Nexus. Whereas if you attack with your stronger units first, they can block your strongest unit, and they can get the lifesteal using Spirit's Refuge. That way they receive the least damage to the Nexus. Hopefully that makes some sense. In Ionia, it's generally considered the sort of Nope region, and the reason for that is Nopeify and Deny. These are just cards you need to be aware of that they can punish. Generally, a card like Nopeify is just a card I don't try and play around, because at worst, they punish a 3 mana spell for a 2 mana. You need to always consider that if my opponent has this card, is it completely game losing if they play it? For me, Nopeify on a 3 mana spell usually isn't. Against Deny is a big one to consider, because there are a lot of really expensive spells that Deny can counter, and the mana advantage your opponent gets by using a 4 mana spell and say a 12 mana spell like Feel the Rush, it's pretty game changing. So you just need to be aware that if your opponent's keeping 4 mana up as Ionia, they could have a Deny. Another card which is important to play around from Ionia is Concussive Palm. So usually if you're playing in Runeterra, you always have this decision on your attacking turn is, do I attack straight away or do I play a unit and then attack? If you're attacking straight away, your opponent can play Concussive Palm to stun all the units and stop them attacking, which is a bit annoying. And if you develop a unit, they can play Concussive Palm, stop that unit attacking, and it generates them a Tail of the Dragon, which can be used to block another attack. So it's just a card you need to be aware of, especially if you're going for the kill against your opponent. It may be better to open attack than to try and develop, just because you get more damage through that way. And on to PNZ. So Suit Up is a card which has recently been into meta, mainly because of the Fizz TF deck. And if you see a Fizz TF deck, it's probably got Suit Up. You might also see it in some Teemo decks. I've made a few Teemo decks in the past which have used Suit Up. I quite like this card. I think it's a really fun card. If you're trying to use removal against TF Fizz deck, just be aware that they could have Suit Up. And because it can get discounted, ignore this 4 mana. If they have 2 mana up, they could potentially use Suit Up. And in PNZ, they have an absolute ton of removal spells. It's just a removal damage region. You need to be aware of these being potentially used on your Nexus, as well as your units. So you don't want to develop valuable units into Mystic Shot or get excited, just because you don't want to give them too much value. But again, if you're trading 2 mana for 2 mana, that's fine. And similarly, if you're trading 3 mana for Get Excited, that's usually good because they have to discard a card as well. So you get a small bit of card advantage from that as well. Static Shock's just a card you need to be aware of, especially when you're setting up how you're blocking and trading. You don't want to get 2 units down on 1 health and give them 2 kills for 1 card, basically. Thermo Beam. And now this is a card which is really strong if you don't play around it correctly. So one thing I play a lot of is a Teemo. I like a lot of Teemo decks. And basically, if you play Teemo on turn 1, they can Thermo Beam it, getting 1 mana for 1 mana, right? But if I wait until turn 2 to play my Teemo, their Thermo Beam now costs 3 mana. So they will be trading 3 mana for 1 mana. Alternatively, because I've waited to turn 2, they could also use something like Mystic Shot, but then they're trading 2 mana for 1 mana. And it's all about this sort of mana trade and card advantage trade. That's all card games are. Understanding that trading of mana, the trading of card advantage, and the trading of Nexus health. Usually, to beat Thermo Beam, I will just delay playing my unit a turn. It's very similar with much more expensive units. Tri-Beam Improbulator is another card which has seen a rise in popularity over the last couple of months, really, in a Draven Ez deck. So if you're against Draven Ezreal, you'll see this. And you need to keep track of how many free cost cards they've played. And that way you know how much damage it does. And you try and not play a unit which gives them a lot of value from Tri-Beam Improbulator. That's the main way you play around these cards. I've said it a lot. Just don't give your opponent a good mana trade for his cards. Similarly, Aftershock's the same, and it's also a card you need to be worried about going Nexus. Slow cards going Nexus is also a big thing I play around a lot. Let's say I'm against a very aggressive deck. It tries to burn down my Nexus really quickly. I'm on 2 Nexus health. It's just passed on to my attack. This situation does happen quite a lot. I could choose to open attack, but if my opponent has some removal, he would kill one of my units. But in that situation, you always open attack, because if I don't open attack, he could have a slow card like Aftershock, which could kill me. And additionally, if he had removal anyway, he could just use it on my Nexus to kill me. Slow spells, you really punish with open attack. I really want to stress that point. If you want to beat a slow spell, do a lot of open attacks. Next up, we have Noxus. So Noxus doesn't really have that many combat tricks they use. I went through the list, and the only one which I considered being used a lot was Brothers Bond. And this is usually used in like discard aggro or generally aggressive decks, and they use it to give that bit more damage. And the main way I'm thinking about this is if you're blocking, just remember that they could do extra damage using Brothers Bond. So if you're like, oh, do I want to block with this valuable champion? It will die, it'll be costly. Sometimes you just have to block with that champion because if they play Brothers Bond, you're dead that turn. And Noxus has a lot of removal spells which are based around having units damaged. So you'll have Ravenous Flock. I've put Scorched Earth in here as well, but there's also Noxian Guillotine, which is basically the same as Scorched Earth, so I didn't want to put another card on the diagram, which is basically the same. And it's just cards you need to be aware of if your unit is damaged, and in Ravenous Flock's case, if it's stunned as well. There's not really much you can do to play around them in a lot of decks, but if you can avoid taking any damage on your key units, Culling Strike is a card which can get a lot of value and you need to be careful about as well, especially if they use it on some of your valuable champions. You just need to make sure you have a way to buff it outside of that free attack range as soon as you play it. Noxian Fervor is a card which is usually seen in aggressive archetypes. It's a 3 mana deal 3 potentially to your Nexus. That's a lot of damage and a lot of good value for them. So you really need to make sure you save removal spells to cancel Noxian Fervor, and be aware that if you use a removal spell, they might use Noxian Fervor on that unit you're removing. And most importantly, if you're against aggressive archetypes, this annoys me to no end, is when you attack in with a lifesteal unit, then they block it and use Noxian Fervor to deny the lifesteal and do free damage to your Nexus. Decimate, very similar to what I mentioned about Aftershock, that it's a direct damage to Nexus tool, and basically if you're in range where Decimate can kill you, you need to just open attack. You cannot afford to do anything else. There are situations where, right, if they have Decimate, you open attack, you still don't kill them, then they Decimate afterwards. In that case, you do as much damage as you can that turn in hope that they don't draw Decimate the next turn. If a card beats you, you never play around it. That's the rule. Reckoning, pretty much only ever seen in Ash Sejuani and Ash Riven decks. So usually against these decks, you need to be finding ways to remove their 5+ power allies so they can't play big cards like this. And if you can keep all their 5 power allies dead, you basically brick this card in the hand. That's the main way you play around it. If you can't kill all their 5 costs, just be aware that you could be playing in a Reckoning if you continue to develop. So onto the units with Noxus. I put a few here just because I feel like these ones are really important to play around. Arachnoid Sentry, a card I'm absolutely awful at playing around actually. It's a 3 mana stun, it's a development punisher. So like I said before, if you choose not to open attack and you play a unit, they can stun one of your units. Because it's a unit, it's effectively slow speed. So the big way you counter this is just by open attacking. Leviathan for 8 mana. If you're against a Swain deck, they almost definitely run Leviathan. And if Swain's leveled and they have Swain on the board and they drop Leviathan, you don't have a way to deal with it. You have 3 of your units stun locked for pretty much the rest of the game. Against Swain decks, once they get to 8 mana, make sure you have a way to deal with the Leviathan. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Similarly, Captain Farron, typically seen in Draven Ezreal decks. The 8 mana, he creates 2 Decimates, not 3 Decimates now, so that card is a little inaccurate. If you don't have a decent way to block him or stop his attack, if he gets a lot of overwhelm damage off, plus the Decimate, he can pretty much kill you on the spot. So if your opponent's on 8 mana playing Draven Ez, you need a decent way to stop him attacking, either through a high health blocker, or stunning him, or just straight up removing him if you have a way to do that. On to Shadow Isles, and like you look at this, it's just the biggest list ever. And that's just because Shadow Isles have so many tools. And with Anivia coming back into the meta, you're going to see a lot of these. Like, Anivia pretty much runs very few units and a lot of spells, so you just see a lot of these in Anivia control decks. So Vile Feast is a 1 damage ping, not much you can do to avoid that, but it's mostly about keeping enough mana up that you can use a buff or a healing tool to keep your unit out of that 1 mana health range. Black Spear, deal 4 damage if a unit's died. This isn't very common, and I'll say for the most part, don't play around this unless you're sure that it's in their deck. Be aware that if you kill one of their units, they could then use Black Spear. The box, very popular in Anivia decks, especially at the moment, and you just need to be aware if your opponent has 4 mana up, they could potentially, at fast speed, kill all the units you play that turn, and because it's at fast speed, they can wait until you attack and then play it to make sure they kill as many units as possible. Because of that, you don't want to overcommit into the box. Withering Wail, deal 1 to everything. Generally, these fast spell speeds are considered open attack punishers. The one exception being the box, because that requires you to develop to use it. So basically, if you attack in and your opponent can get great value from a Withering Wail, don't open attack, develop first, and develop units with more than 1 health. Similarly with Grasp, 5 mana deal 3. It's not a removal spell you really think about, right? You're playing your units with 3 health, usually around turn 3. So this is usually a while after. The main way Grasp gets you is if you're attacking in, you commit all your buffs or something to your unit, and then they use Grasps to stay alive. It's a card you just need to be aware of when you're going for the kill on one of these slow Shadow Isles control decks. Atrocity, mostly seen in either aggressive Shadow Isles decks or Tryndamere Trundle Feel the Rush decks. And it's a card which is usually used as a finisher, so it's just something you need to be aware of, that if your opponent has 6 mana up, do not overcommit because they could potentially kill you with an Atrocity. And Vengeance is also another one to consider. It's a high cost spell, so if you're playing something which costs less than 7 mana, you're quite happy trading a Vengeance for it. Next up is Harrowing, and the Harrowing is one of these cards again that if you don't play around or not prepared for, could potentially lose you the game on the spot. So if your opponent has 9 mana up, just be aware that they could spawn a whole board of stuff, so you need enough mana to have a bunch of blockers so you can block everything that they come in. They're ephemeral, so they'll die anyway. Finally, we have Ruination, and this is a card I think a lot of people complain about, just because it's a strong card. Like, there's no denying it's a strong card. It's not OP, it's just strong. And it's a slow spell. That's the most important thing. You need to really start thinking about Ruination from turn 6 onwards, where your opponent could have 6 normal mana and 3 spell mana. And the big way you punish this is open attacking. Next up, we're on Bilgewater, which is very, very empty. But first up, we've got Mind Meld, and this is typically seen in Fizz TF and also Affiliates TF versions now, becoming quite popular. So it's just a card you need to be aware of, that if your opponent has 7 mana, they could potentially use Mind Meld and kill you that turn. So make sure, if possible, you have a way to block as many of their units as possible in case they use Mind Meld. And next up, we have Twisted Fate. And actually, when I posted this on Reddit, there was like some discussion about like, why is TF on there? And I'm like, the reason TF is on here is because of red card and gold card. It has red card, deal 1 damage to all your units, so make sure you don't have too many 1 health units. And gold card, which is deal 2 to your strongest unit and stun it. If you're against a TF deck and you have a decent open attack, and they could potentially play TF and stun your strongest unit, and then you no longer have a good attack, just open attack. Don't develop if you have that risk of being stunned and it makes your attack rubbish. Finally, we have Targon, the most popular region at the moment. The one thing you'll notice about Targon is it doesn't have any fast speed removal. Because it doesn't have any fast speed removal, again, it's another one of these regions which gets punished a lot by open attacking. And also, one thing you'll notice about all these removal spells, that they are celestial cards, so they need to be invoked. Don't play around these cards all the time. Like, that's important. Don't play around these cards all the time. Play around these cards when they're potentially invoked by a card which can create them. And what I mean by that is, if they have a generic invoke card, like the range of stuff that just an invoke anything give is so ridiculous that I do not play around these cards if they just have a general invoke. But if they have something like Spacey Sketcher, invoke a 1-3 cost, then I'll start playing around Crescent Strike. If they have Solari Priestess, I'll then start playing around Meteor Strike and Falling Comet. And if they play something like Starshapen or Aurelian Soul, then I'll start considering Supernova. But if they just have a general invoke anything, like, you just cannot play around everything they invoke, so I just consider it nothing, basically. So that's all the slow spells. Done it in a bit of a weird order this time, but we'll go back to the burst one now. Pale Cascade +1/+1. Just make sure your opponent doesn't get too much value if they potentially have this, because it's got the draw as well. It's always going to be a good trade for them. Hush is a good way of removing all the buffs from one of your units, so this really is strong against decks like Fiora Shen, which is popular. So you just need to make sure you have a way to rebuff your unit after they hush it. Next up, we have Bastion, and this is like Deny, but less good, I guess. So if you're playing a removal spell into unit, just be aware that Targon could use Bastion to protect it. So try and keep up enough mana to use another ping spell. So I'm mainly thinking if you're playing Shadow Isles and you're using Vengeance on a unit, make sure you have enough mana to use a Vile Feast as well. That way you can ping off the Bastion and then use the Vengeance to kill the unit. Starshapen, just a card you need to keep in mind if you're playing an aggressive deck and going for the kill on Targon, that even though it looks like you can kill them on board, they could have Starshapen to keep themselves alive. Moonlight Affliction, similar to Hush, you play around it where you can and try and rebuff your units after they've been silenced, but you can't always play around this card. Finally, we have the Serpent, and this is a Celestial card as well, so if your opponent plays a Spacey Sketcher or another invoke a 0-3 cost, then just be aware of the Serpent. This is one which catches me out a lot of the time, and just be aware, even without mana, they could play the Serpent and challenge in. So if you've got something like Twisted Fate in your hand, and you haven't played him yet, your opponent's spent all his mana, but they haven't attacked yet, just be aware that they could have the Serpent in hand, so wait for them to attack and then play your Twisted Fate. So that's it for all the cards. This video has gone on a lot longer than I expected. I've been sitting here recording for almost 50 minutes here. Hopefully I'll cut it down to be a lot shorter than that. I didn't want this to be a 50-minute video. But hopefully you find this useful, and definitely check out my Twitter to get the cheat sheet. I really think that's where you'll get the benefit from this, being able to look at the sheet as you play and knowing what to play around. And if it's something you guys like, I will actually do updated versions of this sheet in the future, because as the meta changes, the cards on this list will change as well. So if you want me to keep this updated in the future, let me know by leaving a comment below. And if you found the video helpful, please leave a like and subscribe to see more guides just like this. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a good day.